Welcome, everyone. Thank you very much for taking the time out of your afternoon to hop onto this webinar. We've got the wonderful Marie Coombs, who will be speaking through everything in neurodiversity with you and answering all of your wonderful questions. We'll have a nice Q&A at the end, but feel free throughout the session as well in the webinar just to input anything in the chat. Myself, Katrina, or Roxanne will be there to answer if there's anything that you want to say. We're going to come off mute, and I'm sure we'll be able to answer it that way. From our front, that is everything, and we'll be distributing the link out and we call it a delegate zone, which is a unique web portal, so that have a lot of information on regarding this topic subject. We also have a course that runs closely aligned to the topic conversation today that we'll do a bit more information for at the end of the session before the Q&A. We will be able to explain what's involved in it, the objectives behind it, and basically just elaborate a bit more following this topic. But I'll hand over to the wonderful Marie.
Thank you very much. Lovely to see a lot of people turn up today. It's always nice to run a webinar where people actually turn up. That's always a great start. So yes, my name is Marie Coombs. I am one of the TCM Principal Resolution Consultants. I think that's what my role is at the moment. But I also do a lot of work in the mental health sphere and the neurodiverse sphere. I'm also a mental health first aid instructor as well. And the whole area of neurodiversity and mental health, basically anything that's going on in terms of our thought processes and our emotions, is something that's really, really important to me, really interesting to me, for lots of reasons. And what I'm going to do today is just take you through some of those things. So there's a few faces that I do recognise, but there's some people that don't know me. So I'll just talk a little bit about my background. So the reason why neurodivergence is such an important topic for me is because I felt different all my life. Never felt like I really fit in anywhere, never really felt like I felt comfortable anywhere. Couldn't understand why certain environments would annoy me one day, but the next day I'd be absolutely fine. Couldn't understand why I was always bored. Did well at school, so never really had any particular issues at school. And that's because I learned to hide my symptoms. And it's only in the last 6 months that I've actually found out that all of that stuff I had going on as a child, and all the stuff that I've been hiding from the world since has actually been ADHD. So I've recently been diagnosed with neurodiversity. And it happened because I got to a place where I ended up in a significant conflict with a member of my family, ended up in a significant conflict. And a lot of the reason for that conflict was the result of my neurodiverse symptoms. And one of the things that I will touch on as we go through the conflict section of today is I will talk a little bit more about how those symptoms showed up and kind of the sort of things that we might see in our day-to-day lives and the things we might see in the workplace as a result of some of those symptoms. And it's something that I'm hugely passionate about. I've been a mediator now for 10 years. I did my training with TCM 10 years ago. It's my 10-year anniversary, so I'm quite excited. But the neurodiverse sphere of mental health hasn't really been talked about until very, very recently. And I'm going to cover off why there's been such an increase in the amount of stuff we've been talking about around neurodiversity. But this is what I'm going to I will be talking about what neurodiversity is and what it's not, what neurodivergence is and what it's not. I'll be talking about neurodiversity and conflict, its role in conflict resolution, and the kind of role that we can play in terms of helping people through conflict resolution. And I will finish today just talking a little bit about the links between mental health, wellbeing and neurodivergence. So a lot to cover in 45 minutes, but I'm going to start off with a few statistics in terms of what neurodiversity is. And interestingly enough, 15 to 20% of the world's population exhibits some form of neurodivergence. So basically 1 in 5 people are potentially neurodivergent or are demonstrating signs and symptoms of neurodivergence. Bearing in mind how many people we have in the room now, I know I'm neurodivergent, but there's a good chance there's probably a few of you that are as well. 25% of CEOs are so it's actually a really common thing in the business world. Having some form of neurodiversity is seen a lot in entrepreneurs, in entrepreneurialism, and dyslexia in particular seems to be quite common in CEOs. 1 in 100 are on the autism spectrum. I'll talk a little bit more about that later on. But less than 1/5 of autistic adults are actually in full-time paid work. There is a large section of the population in the UK who are not in work, possibly because of their neurodiversity, but potentially because they just don't feel that they fit because of that neurodiversity and a lack of neuro inclusion, which is one of the things I'm going to talk about as we go through today as well. And 2/3 of employers admit to having little or no understanding of neurodiversity. These numbers are all from the CIPD or the Office of National Statistics or from the NHS. They are recent numbers. Okay, so let's talk a little bit about what neurodiversity is not. So I'm going to banish a few myths, hopefully. So first things first, neurodiversity is not a mental illness. Neurodiversity, the neurodiverse conditions, are neurological, not psychological. It's to do with neuroscience. It's to do with the thinking side of our brain, the processing side of our brain, whereas mental health is more on the psychological side. It has been seen as a sign of poor intellect, certainly before neurodiversity really came to the forefront in sort of the late 80s, early 90s. Those that my husband was a child of the 70s and was demonstrating signs of dyslexia and was seen as being stupid, not clever, lack of intelligence, but actually it was his dyslexia that was the issue. It's not a sign of poor intellect, but it can come across as people not being able to process information or work with information as easily as people who do not have neurodiverse conditions. It has no impact on our intelligence whatsoever. It doesn't mean that somebody is unemployable. It just means that adaptations may need to be made, the same as for anybody in the workplace. What you will find with people who have neurodiverse conditions is actually they will think very differently from people who may be deemed neurotypical. And actually, you need that diversity of thought, you need that diversity of ideas and all of those kind of things, the way that people think differently, because otherwise you end up with groupthink. You end up with everybody thinking the same way or carry on doing the same things that we've done because we keep doing the same things. Nobody's coming in to do an interrupt. So it isn't about being unemployable. It is certainly not laziness. If anything, it's actually the opposite. What you will often find, it's one of the issues that I have in particular, which I'll talk more about later. We actually find ourselves in freeze mode. We actually can find ourselves overwhelmed with information processing, trying to process the information around us, which can come across as laziness because we might actually be sat there scrolling on our phone. We might be doing something unexpected, not the thing we're supposed to be doing. But that doesn't mean we're lazy. It means we're trying to deal with the thoughts that are rushing through our heads in that moment. We could also be in a situation, which I find myself in quite often, it almost feels like tumbleweed. So it almost feels like tumbleweed in my brain sometimes. And it comes across as laziness because people can't understand why you can't just get started on something. But actually, it's the getting started that is one of the key symptoms of neurodiverse conditions. It's actually not a new thing. There has been a massive increase in the number of diagnoses and people going for diagnoses in the last couple of years, probably the last 18 months, 2 years. Neurodiversity is something that has always been there. It may have been described pre-1980s as, oh, that person's a bit odd or a bit eccentric, or they're just a bit weird, they don't behave the way that the rest of us do. There's a good chance those things were probably neurodiversity. Neurodiversity only really came to the forefront in the 80s, and it was seen as something that naughty little boys tended to have. And because it was deemed something that men or males generally had, women weren't looked at all. It was very rare in the 80s for a female to be diagnosed with any form of neurodiversity, particularly ADHD. The 90s saw the point where neurodiversity was really investigated a lot more closely. And it's towards the back end of the 90s and the early 2000s that it was finally recognised that women also can have neurodiversity. It just looks different for us, and it looks very different for us because what we tend to do is we tend to internalize it. So that hyperactivity that you see in men, that you see in young boys running around being naughty, we internalize that. That's in our brains, and that looks like rushing thoughts. It looks like 20 different voices at once. It's all of the stuff that creates the feeling of overwhelm and the feeling of I don't know where to start. But because it's internalized, because you can't see it, there's a lot of people now who are finally recognizing that actually that isn't, I don't like to use the word normal, but it isn't normal. It's not something that people with a neurotypical brain will go through. I know one of the symptoms that I talked about when I had my diagnosis is I can have 20 different conversations going on in my head all at the same time whilst I'm having a conversation. Right now, I have 6 or 7 different thoughts all firing off in different directions while I'm talking to you. because my brain is in hyperactive mode. One of the things that has really created a big uptick in women in particular receiving a diagnosis is those of us that are children of the 70s and 80s are starting to go through menopause. Change in hormones has made it far more difficult for us to hide our symptoms, which means those symptoms are coming to the forefront more, which means those symptoms are becoming more debilitating. They're creating issues, they're creating conflicts in the workplace, internal and interpersonal conflicts. And the reason why there's been that increase is because we are starting to realize that actually we can get help for these symptoms. So it's not a new thing. We're just more aware of it. And it's definitely not a fad. It has always been there, but it's just not necessarily been recognized in the way that it is now. Neurodiversity isn't the same for every neurodivergent either. It is very tempting to say, oh, all people with ADHD are hyperactive. They're not. There are two sides to ADHD. There is the hyperactive side, but there's also the inattentive side, which I'll talk more about in a second. One of the things that I hear quite often when somebody is talking about somebody who's on the autism spectrum, they can't have eye contact, they don't have empathy. That's not true. Every neurodivergent is different. Yes, some of the symptoms are a lack of or a struggle with emotional intelligence. Some of the symptoms are around struggling to communicate, finding different ways to communicate, but they are different for everybody, the same as they are for neurotypicals. And I put a question mark against this one because one of the things that I hear all the time, and I can't decide yet whether I agree with it or not, is that neurodiversity is a superpower. Neurodiversity gives me my creative thoughts. It gives me those big ideas that I get, but it also means I can't do anything with those big ideas because my brain doesn't let me. I don't know if anybody saw in the news at the weekend, Jessie J's recently been diagnosed, and there's a wonderful quote that's in the article that I read about her. She said it's a superpower as long as you look at it from the right perspective and have the right people around you that can navigate it with you. So that's what neurodiversity isn't. Let's talk about what neurodiversity is. So first things first, in his book, Armstrong said that we need to admit that there is no standard brain. Yes, there are neurotypicals. Yes, there are people who have neurodivergent conditions, but actually all of us think, process and understand the world around us differently. There are traits that neurotypicals have that probably are similar, same as there are traits that people with neurodivergent conditions have that are similar, but there is no standard brain. There is no one size fits all. And I wanted to touch on some of the language because I found the language really confusing when I first started walking down this path. So neurodiversity is a really, it's only really been around for about 20 years. It was coined by Judy Singer, Australian psychologist in the 1990s. And it means neurological diversity. And neurodiversity is the umbrella term for all the conditions that are classed as neurodiverse. So that's what neurodiversity is. Neurotypical, and again, I don't like to use the word normal, but it's often referred to as the normal function, the normal brain function. So going back to that statistic that I showed at the beginning, that 15 to 20% of us are neurotypical is the other 80%. But even they will think, understand and process information differently from each other. Neurodivergent, this is the person whose brain processes information in a non-typical way. So I am neurodivergent. People with a diagnosis are neurodivergent. So that is a person. And the last one I wanted to touch on was neuro-inclusivity. And the CIPD defined this as recognizing the neurodiversity of your team and taking steps to embrace and leverage different types of information processing, learning, and communication styles. Every single person you work with has a different way of thinking. And it's about creating an environment where we can take into account all those different ways of thinking. These are just some of the neurodiverse conditions. A lot of words on there, appreciate. Some of those may be familiar to you. ADHD, autism, dyslexia, probably the three most well-known neurodiverse conditions. But there's some there that aren't quite so well-known. So I don't just have ADHD, I am also dyspraxic as well. So dyspraxic relates to coordination. So I struggle with my lefts and rights. I can trip over in an empty room. I was seen as a child as being really clumsy, and now I know that's dyspraxia. So if you have somebody who that around you that is always covered in bruises, always getting into some form of scrape or other, there is a possibility it could be related to dyspraxia. They could just be clumsy, I suppose, but it could be related to dyspraxia. Dyscalculia is related to numbers. It's the processing of numbers. That's one of the others that's on there. Tourette's is actually, or Tourette's syndrome rather, is actually a neurodiverse condition as well. It's the tics, it's the verbal whistling, phrases out of context, shouting things out, movements, eye rolling, jerking, basically any form of strange, what we probably call strange behaviour, could potentially be a sign of Tourette's. Gets worse during stressful times, but it's always there. The other neurodiverse condition that I have, and it's not actually on there, I've just realised, is Irlen syndrome, which is very similar to dyslexia. But Irlen syndrome is to do with light. So if I walk into a room that has fluorescent lighting, I have dyslexic symptoms. If I walk into a different room that doesn't have fluorescent lighting, I don't have dyslexic symptoms. So there are a lot of conditions out there that we're still trying to get our heads around. We're still trying to understand what they are and how they impact. The key thing to remember is there are a lot of signs and symptoms that we may be putting down to different behaviours, unacceptable behaviours, but actually there could be something else going on. And it is about being neuro-inclusive. But how does this relate to conflict, which is obviously the main crux of what I wanted to talk about today? So in terms of conflict, just going to do a quick reminder for those of you that maybe haven't seen this before. These are generally thought of as the 5 conflict styles, and we all have a conflict style that we naturally navigate to, that we feel comfortable with, that we probably use before we use anything else. For somebody who is neurotypical, switching between the different conflict styles in different situations may be relatively easy. Being in a place where you need to collaborate quite quickly could come as second nature to some people. If you're neurodiverse, so my example, I tend to be a turtle. I am very much a withdrawing type of conflict person. What I find, if my neurodiverse condition isn't under control, if my ADHD in particular isn't under control, I struggle to collaborate. I struggle to change into that conflict style that I need to, which as a mediator can be really frustrating sometimes. Thankfully, it's not happened in a mediation yet. But I do struggle to flip into the collaborating space. I'm more likely to jump into the shark space. I'm more likely to jump into a competing or directing style of conflict. Partly because of the tricks that my ADHD plays on my brain. Some of the other reasons why these conflict styles are particularly important, these are also loosely linked to the 4F response. So fight, flight, freeze and fawn. So shark is fight, turtle tends to be flight or freeze. Teddy, the harmonizer, is the fawn, which is people pleasing for those of you that maybe haven't heard that before. They are loosely linked to those 4Fs. So I want you to just bear that in mind as I go through some of the signs and symptoms we might see in conflict. So there are 6 key things that I wanted to talk about in relation to neurodiversity. And the first one that I wanted to talk about was task initiation, which links back to what I said at the beginning, which was around laziness and how people who have neurodiverse conditions, we're not lazy. We struggle with something called executive function. And what executive function is that ability to start a task, to continue a task, to complete a task. It's not that we don't want to do it, although in some situations, if we are really, really struggling to see the why of a task, actually starting it can be impossible. We very much need to understand the why, but actually getting started on a task is absolutely horrendous sometimes. So this is the one thing that made me see that I may have a particularly neurodiverse condition. And how this manifested to me was I was traveling for TCM. In fact, I was in a hotel, messaging my husband to say goodnight to him, and I couldn't actually bring myself to send the message. I couldn't even bring myself to write the message. And it's not that I didn't know what to say, just physically could not get started. I couldn't get the link between my brain and my fingers to start typing the message. And it wasn't that I didn't want to do it, I just couldn't do it. And it was at that moment that I realised that something might be wrong with my brain. And I went immediately to the illness rather than the neurodiverse at that point. But I couldn't understand why I couldn't get started. Couldn't understand why I've got one side of my brain screaming at me, just send the message, and the other side of my brain that just looks like tumbleweed. Task initiation can be really, really frustrating. It can generate strong emotions in people who are struggling with task initiation. And for those around them, it looks like laziness. It looks like they can't do their job. It looks like they can't do whatever it is that they're being expected to do. And as you can probably appreciate, that can create quite a lot of conflict. It can create resentment with people around you. It can create internal conflict. That why can't I do it? Why can't I be like everybody else? Thinking flexibly, speaking flexibly is also difficult. Thinking flexibly is really tough. Being able to switch quickly. So you may find somebody with ADHD, if they are in if they have hyperactive traits, they may jump around quite a lot in terms of what they're saying. So actually, you might think they can think quite flexibly, but that is when they're in control of that, or when they have control over what they want to think about. If they are asked by somebody else to think about lots of different things, that's the point our brain just goes, I can't do that. We cannot jump quite as quickly as everybody else. That may manifest itself as well in terms of starting the next task. So it's linked to task initiation. If we finished a task, it sometimes takes a while for our brain to switch to the next task. Being able to jump into one task to another can be really, really difficult. And again, it can lead to frustrations. It can lead to people thinking, well, you're not processing these 6 different jobs fast enough. But yeah, it's because I'm struggling to switch between them. I'm struggling to actually understand or get my brain to work on the next piece. Working memory is also really difficult as well. So working memory is around remembering instructions, remembering what we've got to do next. I can sit at my desk one day and do a task without thinking about it. The next day, I have to pull out my instructions and remind myself of what I'm doing. Remembering things that you've been told, remembering tasks. Sometimes remembering words is really difficult. So delivering this, a little bit nervous, always get a little bit nervous when I'm presenting, which makes some of my neurodiverse symptoms worse. And one of those is words falling out of my head. So there's a couple of things that I've had to do. I've had to make sure I've got a script today, so that if those words fall out of my head, it doesn't matter, I've got them in front of me. So it's making sure that those adaptions are there, depending on what that person is particularly dealing with. And the working memory one can be really frustrating, because we can be searching for a word, and I've described it to somebody the other day, it's like a helium balloon. You kind of know what you're trying to say, but it's floating away from you. You can't get it back. Again, leads to frustration. It can also lead to people around you looking at you as if you've lost your mind. That's such a simple word to remember. Why can't you remember it? Are you stupid? There's some of the responses that I've had from people when I've had moments when my working memory hasn't worked the way it's supposed to. Impulse control is also a challenge, particularly with hyperactive ADHD. And that impulse control can look like rushing into new ideas without thinking them through, having lots of different ideas and just jumping straight in with both feet. So I don't know if anybody's heard of Alex Partridge, who is the guy that set up Lad Bible and Unilad. He's recently been diagnosed with ADHD, and I really would encourage you, if you wanted to know more about neurodiversity, follow him on social media, because he does some really brilliant short videos on different types of neurodiversity. His podcast is called ADHD Chatter, and he talks a lot about how his ADHD shows up, in particular the impulse control. He'll have an idea at 2 o'clock in the morning. By 3 o'clock in the morning, he's registered 6 different domain names. 6 hours later, they're all forgotten, but he's still paying for them. That impulse control, we can struggle having control over how our impulses manifest themselves. Now, that can have some really serious repercussions, because it can create financial difficulties. So gambling can come under neurodiversity as a sign of neurodiversity, because we do not have impulse control. We can't stop ourselves. Spending money on mobile phone games, going shopping, anything that involves money, jumping into things too quickly. All signs of impulse control. Planning and organising, again, linked to task initiation, linked to thinking flexibly. I can sit down with a to-do list and still actually have no idea of what I'm going to do first. I struggle with prioritising. I can look at a list of 5 tasks on Monday and be able to prioritise them, no problem whatsoever. I come to a different list on Tuesday and my brain just will not allow me to prioritize those things. So alongside all of these is also the unpredictability as well. Come back to that in a second. But it can be really, really difficult when you're trying to plan a project or trying to plan a piece of work or trying to plan your day, your week, your month, how you're going to achieve any goals that you've got. On one day, you may do that planning really, really well. You may be able to organize yourself really well. But on another day, that might show very, very differently. It may be that we cannot plan, or those plans that we have through impulse control get ripped up and we write a new plan. The last one, probably the one that people probably may identify with the most, is emotional intelligence. This is having control over our emotions and recognizing emotions in others. I cannot recognize emotions in others unless they are very, very obvious. I spend, as a mediator, one of the things I have to do is express empathy. And in a mediation setting, I will often say to people, you know, I'm sensing some frustration or some anger from you. I've had to learn what they sound like because I struggle to actually recognize in terms of facial expressions what they look like. I struggle with self-awareness sometimes. In some situations, I give too much information about myself, as some people who know me can attest to, because I'm not always aware of the other people around me. I'm not always aware of the impact I'm having on other people. I've had to learn a lot of these skills that come as second nature to other people. Emotional outbursts can be very common with neurodivergent conditions. They can come from a place of stress and frustration in a world that isn't built for people who are neurodiverse, but they are also signs and symptoms of neurodiversity themselves. And one of the things I wanted to touch on is something called rejection-sensitive dysphoria. And rejection-sensitive dysphoria, I'm finding, is coming up a lot in mediation and a lot in some of the difficult conversations I'm having. It's directly related to ADHD, and it's where somebody feels severe emotional pain because of an actual or a perceived sense of failure or rejection. What that means is when somebody with RSD is more likely to become embarrassed or self-conscious, they're more likely to have task avoidance feeding directly into that task initiation to avoid failure. They may be perfectionists. Linking back to the conflict styles, they may be people pleasers. You may find that they're very much the harmonizer in the group. Over-analysis happens a lot with rejection-sensitive dysphoria, as does, as I've already said, the emotional outburst, the fighting, competing style of conflict. Or they could internalize that emotion, which then leads to a cascade of inner talk, inner judgment, which means that we tend to withdraw even more, move away. We can isolate ourselves because of the fear of rejection. It's not just a case of, you've not done this piece of work very well. All right, okay, I'll do better next time, which tends to be what a neurotypical response would be. And I'll give you an example of this. So I also have I also have to deal with RSD. And I did a piece of work the other day. It wasn't shared with anybody, but my husband proofread it for me. You've made a mistake in this. Somebody who's neurotypical might go, oh, okay, give it here, I'll correct it. I went from, I need to correct that, to, I can't do this job, to, I am the worst person in the world, to, I shouldn't be here in the space of 15 minutes because of RSD, because of the cascade of internal self-talk that happened just because my husband said to me on a day when my ADHD symptoms were really struggling, said to me, you've made a mistake in this. And it can be simple little things that to anybody else around us, we may look at them and go, that's nothing. I'll just fix that. It's fine. If somebody has ADHD and has RSD, that can go from being something minor to being the worst thing in the world. Catastrophizing happens a lot with RSD, but you maybe don't see it. It tends to be internalized. What it might look like is that person going off sick after a appraisal score or a one-to-one. It could be having finished a project that person can't engage in the workplace. They may withdraw. You may find that they don't engage with their colleague. They don't talk to their colleagues as much. There's all sorts of ways that these things can manifest themselves. And what tends to happen is somebody with a diagnosis of any of the neurodiverse conditions won't just have one of these. They'll have all of these in varying degrees. Some will be worse than others. So for me, my big ones are around emotional intelligence, impulse control, and task initiation. For somebody else, it may be working memory and planning and organising. It's understanding who you have in front of you and helping them work with the world around them. So this sort of summarizes a little bit some of the things that I've already covered. In terms of what we can do, and I mean those of us that are neurodivergent as well as the neurotypicals, is understand that there probably is a lot of internal conflict going on as well. So it isn't just about the signs and symptoms that we see, it's about being mindful of what might be going on inside for that person. And that might be just saying, you know what, let's go and sit and have a chat. Talk to me about what's going on. Forget this stuff that we've been talking about. Let's just take some time to have a chat. No pressure whatsoever. If you are running some form of process, whether it be an HR process, whether it be an investigation, a mediation, a training course, adjust the process, not the person. It's one of the simplest things that we can do in terms of reasonable adjustments, is just looking at how that process is impacting that person, and we can make minor tweaks. So, for example, in terms of adjusting the process, not the person, you may just have shorter meetings. That may be enough for somebody who is struggling with inattentive ADHD to be able to engage for the full amount of time. But ask them what works for them. So seek to understand how the neurodivergent condition affects them, but always expect the unexpected. Because unfortunately, things like RSD, things like impulse control issues, things like working memory, we can find ourselves in a place where the unexpected can happen. I've forgotten deadlines, even though I've got them written in 20 different places and I've got alerts. If I've cancelled that alert, that deadline disappears. That deadline is no longer in my head. And then all of a sudden it'll come out of nowhere and, oh, I've got that deadline to do. So expect the unexpected. Self-care needs to be prioritised for people, for anybody who has neurological or psychological conditions, whether that be neurodivergence or mental health conditions. Self-care does need to be prioritised because we tend to forget ourselves. We tend to forget any support that we might need, but also make sure you look after yourself as well, because supporting somebody with any neurological or psychological disorder or issue, condition, whatever it might be, isn't an easy thing to do, and it will impact you as well. And be aware of what is available within your organisation, within your local area, that person can be signposted to. One of the biggest issues at the moment with neurodivergence is the waiting lists, and the NHS are absolutely horrendous. In my area in South Yorkshire, they range anywhere from 2 years up to 7 years to even get an initial consultation for a diagnosis. And in the meantime, that person sat there with all these symptoms. They're trying to understand what's going on for them. But there is help out there that isn't NHS related that can help them in the meantime, that can help them with those signs and symptoms. So understand what is available. And just to touch briefly on the last couple of topics I wanted to touch on, because I just realised what the time is. Time blindness is also a symptom of ADHD. Mental health and neurodiversity. There is a strong link between the two. They are different. As I said, neurodiversity is neurological, mental health is psychological, but there is often a link between the two. You will often find people with neurodiverse conditions will also have been diagnosed with mental health conditions, or they may have been diagnosed with the mental health condition first. So I have a diagnosis of depression and anxiety as well. Since I've been medicated with ADHD medication, I no longer have depression. My depression was actually undiagnosed and untreated ADHD. I still have anxiety, which is great with the inattentive and hyperactive sides of ADHD. But sometimes it's worthwhile understanding whether those symptoms are linked or whether they're separate. That's what comorbidities means. It's having more than one diagnosis. One thing I haven't really touched on is something called masking. This is what I was referring to earlier as hiding symptoms. This is what women in particular have been very, very good at doing, because there's always been a pressure, certainly I felt it, that we need to be good girls. We need to do what we're told. We need to get on with what we're supposed to be doing and be able to, do well at school and do well at work. Masking is hiding those symptoms so we don't get found out. We don't get found out that we have those issues. Or we use masking because actually that is our way with dealing with undiagnosed and untreated symptoms. Since I've been diagnosed, my masks are starting to drop. So I'm allowing some of my ADHD traits to come out, but I talk about them. I try and raise awareness. That's one of the reasons I'm leading this webinar today. I try and raise awareness about them because 15 to 20% of the world's population is neurodiverse. So your role, it isn't to diagnose. Nobody is expecting anybody to sit there and go, well, you've clearly got ADHD, or you have mental health condition, or you have whatever other neurodiverse condition it might be. But you can empower, you can give space to people. And what that looks like is creating a space for psychological safety. Now, as a mediator, the second I sit in a room with somebody, my first goal is to create psychological safety for that person. So understand what makes them feel safe to let go of some of those masks and to be able to engage with their brain rather than fight it. Reduce stigma. One of the things I talked about at the beginning was some of the myths around neurodiversity. Challenge those myths when you hear them. And at the same time, try and raise awareness as well. Remember, it's one size fits one, not one size fits all. So take the time to find out what works for that person. What particular signs and symptoms are they struggling with? Is there a prevalence in your organisation of particular types of symptoms? Not diagnoses, symptoms. And what can you put in place to help people manage those symptoms better? And also take the time to resolve conflict. People with ADHD, people with any form of neurodiverse conditions will find, there's a statistic, a third of neurodivergent employees have said that their experience at work in relation to their neurodivergence had a negative impact on their mental well-being. So resolving conflict, giving space, giving a voice back to people is a great way of encouraging anybody who's neurodiverse or neurotypical to take control of what's going on for any symptoms that they may have. So I'll hand back to Cameron and the guys in a minute for the Q&A, but I just wanted to share as well, if you want to know more about this topic, I actually run a one-day course through TCM called Psychological Diversity, Strategies for Inclusive Conversations. And you can see on screen there the objectives of that course. But during that course, we do some work around mental health awareness. We talk more about neurodiversity, but we also talk about trauma and how to be trauma informed. And we also touch on other elements that can affect people's psychological and neurological well-being, things like menopause and those kind of things as well, and how to make those as inclusive as possible. So that's on the 16th of September. You can see the details there. It'd be great if you come along. It's a topic, as you've probably gathered, I'm hugely passionate about. But yeah, that is everything that I have prepared. So I'm ready for questions.
Wonderful. Thank you very much. Thank you very much, everyone, for staying along and participating in the chat. It was great to see everyone here today. As we said earlier, the recording will be ended. We will send this out to everyone that's attended today so you can look through, but also be in touch with further materials around this topic subject that Marie has run. Regarding the session, we'll put some details in the follow-up and in the chat as well for you to look through. Again, it's on the 16th of September. Marie will be delivering it. But for the time being, we'll open the floor up to questions. Feel free to come off mute, put anything in the chat, and we will start to answer them.
I'm just getting a bit emotional about some of the comments in the chat, actually. So I've just seen there's a great question in the chat. How can you approach this topic support with those who are unaware or undiagnosed or don't want to disclose? So that's one of the things that actually you can learn from the mediation space, because we don't walk into those situations thinking this person is neurodiverse, this person has a mental health condition. What we do is we create the space to let them talk about whatever it is they want to talk about and gain some understanding and insight. At no point do I sort of say, oh, have you considered diagnosis of ADHD, or have you considered this might be a thing? But what I do is I make sure that that space is as open, honest and safe as possible, so that that person feels free to be open and honest with me. So I'm actually coaching somebody at the moment who is exactly in that space. And at the moment, we haven't even broached the topic of neurodiversity. But what I'm doing is I'm creating that open space, and they're starting to share with me some of the challenges they're finding. And those challenges are clearly ADHD. And what we're doing is we're working on the challenges, not the diagnosis. So I'm working with them to find coping strategies, to find things and understanding, insight into where those challenges may have come from, as opposed to, right, we need to get you some help for this diagnosis that you may or may not have. I hope that's answered the question, but that's effectively kind of what I do.
We have a few more coming through in the chat.
Hi, Marie. This is Mary here. Thank you ever so much. That has been really, really helpful. And because of your own experiences, it really does help. And especially where you say it's sort of, we get caught up that this person might have, what should I do? But actually giving that person the space to be themselves and us to work with them in the way they're coming across makes so much sense. It's almost, why didn't I think about that? That's makes it really clear. So thank you ever so much, and really appreciate your openness in that today. Thank you.
Very welcome. Thank you. Yeah, it's obvious once you know. If you don't know, you don't know what you don't know. And it's the same no matter what we're talking about. You know, if it's not in your frame of reference, if it's not in your experience, then yeah, of course you sit there, oh, how do I deal with this? It's only through the experience I have that I know how to deal with it. So thank you so much for that. And I've just spotted another question. Couple of easy and simple adjustments in a mediation environment to allow better information processing. So a really simple way is actually having a variety of different ways that the mediation information is provided. So I know TCM, they have written information, but they also have videos they can share if somebody wants to engage with it visually rather than written. I watch videos rather than read stuff, or I'll listen to an audio rather than read stuff. So just providing different options for people is such a simple way of helping people feel that they're included. So that's the first thing. The other simple adjustment is just to ask. Ask them what will help them. So I did a mediation probably about 6-7 months ago now with somebody who had a diagnosis of autism, was on the autism spectrum, and they didn't want to do the mediation in a full day. That's fine. We'll do it over 2 days. So sometimes it's just simply having a conversation. There is no magic wand. There is no light bulb moment. Just have a conversation. That is the simplest and most effective adjustment you can make.
I think there were a few more, Marie, further up, one from Laura, and then, well, that might be never actually. I think there was one from Laura just above.
Yeah, regarding the approaching the topic, I think I did cover that, Laura, but if I haven't, please feel free to give me a nudge and I'll talk more about it. Brilliant. Thank you, Laura. Great stuff. Well, I'm on LinkedIn if anybody's got any more questions that maybe you don't feel 100% comfortable asking today, or you can put them privately so that only myself or Cameron will see them. So if there are any questions that you don't necessarily want to be identified for, you can contact me directly as well. And I'll be running the course. Thanks, Cameron, for the reminder.
This is Nancy. I just have a question, because a lot of what you've said is about the mediator and sort of dealing with a person.
Mm-hmm.
But when you're co-mediating and you've got two parties in front of you, it's one thing having that awareness in the morning when you're working with the parties independently. It becomes a lot more complex when you give ownership, in a sense, to them leading the conversation.
Yeah.
Have you sort of got any tips that you could share?
So in a joint meeting, again, I just encourage people to share if they are having challenges. So for example, if rejection sensitive dysphoria comes to the forefront in a joint meeting, I won't say you have rejection sensitive dysphoria. I will say, okay, there's clearly some emotion there. Let's talk about that. Where's that come from? What are you feeling right now? And I just encourage that conversation. One thing that I talk about all the time is just curiosity. I am constantly, consistently curious. I like to understand. It's probably my ADHD brain that encourages it. But I'm constantly curious about the world around me. I'm constantly curious about what people have to say to me. And if I'm co-mediating, because I've done a lot of co-mediation as well, I will have a conversation about any challenges I might have in advance. But also I'll talk about, if I see this in a mediation, don't be surprised if I start asking a stream of curiosity-based questions. Because what I'm trying to do is I'm trying to help that person share their challenges in a way that suits them, but so that the other person can understand why they may have acted that way or where that might have come from. Does that answer your question?
It kind of gives me some pointers, which is helpful. Thank you.
Yep, great stuff. If you've got specifics, I'll happily talk offline if you've got specific cases or specific situations.
Yeah.
Yeah, great stuff. Any other tips on creating a safe space? One of the things actually I didn't talk about was sensory overload. So one of the things that's very common with any neurodiverse condition is the ability to become overloaded via the senses very, very quickly. So try and create a physical environment that is as free from sensory issues as possible. So if you're doing it online, let them mediate in their own home, or let them have the conversation in their own home, sat at home, so that they can control their environment. If you're in the room, the first thing I look for is the fluorescent lighting, because I know that creates sensory overload for me. And if it does for me, it probably will do for other people as well. So I try and create as much natural light as possible. So one of the things you can do to create a safe space is just be mindful of what the sensory input is. And all that means is, what can you hear, see, mainly? I'm not going to go into taste or touch maybe in a mediation, but what you can see and what you can hear. If you're by a busy road, shut the window, for example. If, simple things like that, that we can create a more inviting space for people and is less likely to create sensory overload. I can't see any more questions.
I think that is potentially everything. If you've got any more, we'll give it a minute or so. Feel free to put it in the chat. Otherwise, we'll start to wrap up and we'll end the recording. I'll give it a minute in case anyone's typing away.
And just thank you for all your comments as well. It's taken a lot for me to share my story. For a long time, I had all sorts of things going through my head prior to having my diagnosis. Is there something, is there something seriously wrong with me? Is there something wrong with my brain? I went through the whole range of emotions through my diagnosis. And one of the things I was determined to do was to make sure that other people didn't feel the way that I did. That confusion, that frustration, that hurt and upset is not great in terms of living with that every day. And if it just helps one person, which hopefully it has done today, then actually what I went through was worthwhile. So I just wanted to say thank you for the comments that have been in the chat for my story.
Wonderful. I think that might be potentially then everything. But thank you so much, everyone, for all of your interaction today, all your questions, all your lovely messages to Marie. Really enjoyed doing this session today. Again, the recording will be shared with everyone for you to read through. If you have any questions regarding today's session, the course, Marie herself, feel free to drop myself an email, Marie an email, even on LinkedIn, get in touch. And we'd be more than happy to answer any questions. But that is everything from our TCM today.